Okay, let's reassemble the lower receiver. Got the completely stripped lower receiver. Got the sear plate or sear bar, sear spring, grip screw, grip, magazine release and spring, and magazine release pin, selector lever, trigger pin, hammer pin, hammer and hammer spring, trigger boot, and the retainer, also known as the selector switch spring, rear spacer, and trigger bar. Now to get this started, sear bar or sear plate and the lower receiver. If you take the spring off of this, it's a lot easier to get in, probably easier to get out too. When you put it in, those square shaped cutouts up here on the front, that cutout needs to go facing down, so that goes forward and down, with this tail being up and to the rear. This will just barely fit, so slide it back through here all the way up into the corner, and that will just barely give you enough room to drop the legs down so that it fits behind that plate, just like that. Drop it down, let it slide forward. Spacer, the straight part goes on the bottom, the bent part goes on the top, open of course facing forward. It slides in there in the bottom of the receiver all the way to the back. Now put the sear spring on, and the sear spring just goes around this tab, that tail right there, and then that slides back into the spacer. And when you pull that, that should release and reset the feet that go up there where the trigger goes. Now take the trigger, of course with the trigger face, the shoe facing forward, just set it in there just like that. The trigger bar, remember it has that wedge shape. The wedge goes down and forward just as if it was a shovel. You were trying to use the shovel to scoop, or if it was a straight edge, a blade or something you're trying to clean with. That's how you want it. Okay, inside the weapon, the trigger bar sets underneath the sear plate just like that, with that wedge facing forward right here, and the trigger will set in front of and on top of that wedge just like that. And that's how it will set in the bottom of the receiver right here. Now the object is, as you can see there, you will pull back on the sear plate, and then the trigger bar will go under and behind the trigger, and then those two little machined cutouts on the sear bar, it sets underneath those. Once you get that far, you can go ahead and take your trigger shoe and slide it back on the trigger, and that just, your trigger will tip out far enough that it'll just slide right on there. If it's new, it's going to be a tight fit. Take some Dawn dish soap, put that Dawn dish soap on the trigger, and then slide it over the top of the trigger. It acts as a lubricant to get it on, but then once it dries, it acts kind of sticky to make sure it stays on. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and reassemble the grip and the magazine release. So these two little tabs down on the end, the magazine release is going to set right between them and be held in place by the pin. Whoops. So it's going to face with that spring facing out, and that spring will actually push on the bottom of the grip. So it'll set in here just like this with the tab and the cutout on the bottom of the grip, and that spring facing towards the plastic of the grip, not towards the inside of the gun. So take the lower receiver, take the magazine release, okay, get that lined up between those two tabs, with the holes lined up, and the pin that holds that in will just set right in there. So keep your finger in place on the other side because it'll just fall completely through. It's not in there tight, it literally just sets in there to hold it in place. Sits in there just like that. Tip it up so it doesn't fall out. Take your grip, make sure that the magazine release sets on top of that cutout, so it'll be slid in there like this. Put it over the top of the hole where the screw goes. Compress that, hold it in place, and then reattach that screw. Next thing we're going to do is install the hammer. You'll need, of course, the hammer pin and the hammer and hammer spring assembly. The legs on the spring face towards the back of the gun, and they fit underneath the sear plate or sear bar. Push it in so it lines up with the hole. Go from left to right and reinsert that pin. Set it down. I actually like to use a block for this, just to make sure that pin stays in place. And you have to reapply that clip. Now, just like I did to disassemble it, I like to take some silicone grease or some gear grease for a fisher, if you're a fisherman, regular old gear grease for your rod and reel, and stick a bunch of that on there, because that will keep this clip from flying all over the place if you miss. Get that started in the grooves in that pin. Just push it in until it locks in place, and you should be good to go. Shot cloth. Wipe that off. First thing we're going to do is we're going to put the retainer or the selector spring, whatever you want to call it, in place. Now if you zoom in here, or if I zoom in here for you, okay, if you zoom in here, you'll see that this is your trigger right here, this little piece that I'm moving. Back part of the frame here, this is actually welded on, it's a permanent part of the frame. The bend on that retainer fits over the top of that. The foot goes in this tiny little groove right here, goes underneath that and facing in like this. So the easiest way to do that is take that foot and face it up and forward, hook underneath this piece here, slide it until it's through, and then just rotate it until that foot is facing in, and the bend on the back side of that retainer is setting in the tiny little notch right there on that welded piece. And that will keep it, if you tip it a little bit, you'll see that keeps it clear of this hole right here. That hole is where your trigger pin goes. Your trigger pin has this groove, and that groove is where that retainer goes. The retainer is going to come up underneath that and fit in place, but the tension that holds that in place is going to be tensioned by the selector switch. So for now, you're not worried about this. You just want to make sure, you're not worried about the retainer, you just want to make sure that it's down and out of the way by ensuring that it's seated properly in that groove. That will keep it out of the way while you insert the trigger pin. Insert the trigger pin from left to right. You'll have to play with the trigger a little bit to get that lined up. Push it through until it seats in the hole on the far side. Now that retainer should set right up underneath that groove. Now the selector switch goes in, it'll be from the right hand side of the gun. You can actually see the retainer in the hole, so you need to pull that retainer up out of the way while you slide this pin in underneath it. You should be able to do that just with your finger. Slide that in until it actually goes through the hole on the other side, and then once it's through that hole on the other side, that retainer should just fall right into the groove on the selector switch. It's got the same type of groove that the trigger pin does. To check it, rotate it back and forth a couple of times, and it should actually click and lock in place. And that is your completely reassembled lower receiver. Now, to make sure everything functions, take the hammer and cock it. If you place the weapon on safe, you should not be able to pull the trigger, because the thickness of that selector bar keeps the trigger from depressing all the way. If you rotate it to fire, there is a machined groove cut out in that selector switch that allows the trigger to depress further, which will allow it to depress far enough to move that sear plate or sear bar out of the way, which will in fact release the hammer. Now you know you have a fully functioning, or correctly functioning, fully assembled lower receiver.